think of RJ, and this is what I think about trauma more broadly, as a creative endeavor. So this is really attached to what I have consumed and metabolized from the psychoanalytic literature and some other disciplinary literature about what happens in us with pain and trauma and what we do with it. So because that's what restorative justice wants to sort of take up as its object, for the most part, harm, trauma, pain, it's subject to how those things move and operate. You can't abstract them from their nature. When folks experience harm and when folks do harm, even if you've been harmed many times before, it's not this time. And so each time you are traversing into new territory, and who you are is irreversibly impacted.
Yeah.
And so the task before us is, who can I become now in light of what's happened to me? And that requires so much creativity to make and remake yourself in the aftermath of harm. So it's helpful for me to think about RJ facilitating the necessary creative practice that's involved with trying to grow after harm. Because it's like so much uncertainty. You're not who you were before. You're not. You cannot be. On a metabolic level, on a psychic level, you have more information in terms of experience now.
Yeah.
And the process is how to metabolize that, and then psychically and emotionally and in your body. And then what does that mean for like who I am as a person and my identity? And that is where the creativity comes in. And I think that's how I think about restorative justice, as this facilitating folks' creative process of remaking themselves in, through, and after harm. I also think that it'd be good for practitioners to avoid what some psychoanalysts sometimes call traumatophobia, which a lot of therapists and mental health professionals also have, with this real deep fear of trauma, that trauma is something that needs to be sealed off in the past, right? We're going to work through it and heal it and leave our trauma behind, that we're going to get over our trauma or even healing. And I think our relationship to it has been really myopic. It has been seen as purely a negative space, something to be extinguished and avoid. And I just don't have that relationship to trauma. I think what we see in practice is no one gets over the trauma. I don't know anybody, as a practitioner, therapist, as well as in discussions with my colleagues who are therapists, I don't know one person who has gotten over their trauma. I think people do things with their trauma. And that seems the important focal point for me. And I think RJ can intervene in that trajectory. It's not the end all be all. It may play a role in that for some people. But that's what I understand sort of RJ as maybe having some facilitative role in what folks do with their trauma. But there's so many other things that support a doing with the trauma besides RJ. And so if our charge is to deal with trauma at a particular point in time for a person, I think it's important to appreciate how it lives in us as a companion, rather than, something that can be put away or set in the past. Trauma is not bound to time like that. And so for me, it's been really helpful to understand it that way, because then I have better expectations for what RJ can do and can't do, what therapy can and can't do, if I better understand that trauma is not something to get over, but the energetic, like the libidinal or sort of energetic charge of trauma, which tends to animate us, can be transmuted into something. And the way that people do with their trauma sometimes will not make sense to people, but it serves some idiosyncratic purpose for them. And I think our jobs as therapists or practitioners is to honor whatever it is that folks need to do with the trauma. And that doing is an end in and of itself and not a means to an end. And the way that they do with their trauma is to make meaning out of it sometimes. Sometimes they physically do and enact. And to also know that that's temporally bound. There is no final destination in terms of the meaning we make of our trauma. We hope that RJ and maybe therapy and maybe profound experiences in nature and maybe peer group, maybe encounters with a romantic other, with children, maybe something happens in that brew that allows people to encounter themselves in a way, and their experiences in a way that they can engage in this process of retranslation, which is a term that I'm borrowing from Laplanche, who was a French psychoanalyst, that we can retranslate these experiences, but it's not final. So it's not like you go to therapy, you do the RJ circle, you have the profound experience, and you're like, okay, I've made new meaning of this experience. Now I have a different relationship to this trauma. That is not the final destination. It's just that you make meaning that is relevant and useful for you at this particular time in your life. And then later, you might retranslate that information again, where it's useful for you at that particular time in your life. So I'm saying all this to say that I think RJ can, if approached a certain way, can help us appreciate the reality of what actually happens with trauma in us and the role of time, and that our meaning making and our relationship to trauma is so temporally bound. It will always be in flux and it never lands anywhere permanently, even with all these interventions, and that the goal of the interventions should be that we're able to make new meanings that serve us better.